Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, a cluster of atypical pneumonia cases have been reported in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And among this cluster, there have been a number of reports of parrot fever. And today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to answer the question, what is parrot fever? So joining me today to talk about psittacosis or parrot fever is Chandana Bala. Chandy is the president of the Global Insight Advisory Network and writes on the intersection of healthcare and technology. She is also a frequent writer for Gideon Informatics. Hi, Chandy. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, ma'am. Let's go ahead and just go out and give a summary about parrot fever.
Yes, like you mentioned, parrot fever is in the news again, but usually it's a rare disease. It's a rare bacterial infection. It is zoonotic, so it is transmissible. It primarily affects birds, but can also affect humans, which is what's happening in Argentina right now. Um, in the early 1800s, when it was first discovered, it was mainly found in parrots. So the disease is also known as parrot fever or parrot disease. Later on, people did realize that it can affect finches, ducks, geese, turkeys, any bird. So it's also known as ornithosis or avian chlamydiosis. And the chlamydiosis comes from the fact that the bacteria that causes this disease is called Chlamydia psittaci.
Okay. You touched on a little bit of history, but can you give us a little more history on the background of the naming and the discovery of the organism?
Yes, absolutely. So, like I mentioned, the first case was discovered in the 1800s. So, 1879, I think in Germany, the first case was reported, and J. Ritter was credited for discovering, connecting diseases in parrots to the human infection. But eventually, more cases kept happening across different continents. But the biggest outbreak that happened was in 1929 to 1930, where something called the Great Parrot Fever Pandemic hit four different continents. It sounds really grand. There weren't that many cases, 800 people infected, and maybe 100 people died, which is unfortunate. But it wasn't, I think what was huge about that was that there was widespread panic and people were really scared about it because they didn't know anything about it. Plus, there wasn't any effective treatment at the time. Penicillin was discovered, but it wasn't available freely for treatment until much later, almost 10 years later. So there was a lot of panic. There was a lot of global trade when it came to parrots at that time, and a lot of diseases because of that, bird-related diseases. It was such a huge deal that President Herbert Hoover at the time banned the import of. The United States president banned the import of parrots or birds into the country until things settled down. So that was very big. So in 19, so like I mentioned, this huge pandemic happened in relative relatively huge pandemic happened in the 1929 to 1930, but it wasn't until the 1970s when the pathogen was first isolated and seen under you could actually get a high resolution image of the bacteria in 1970s. And then in 1978 is when we actually learned about how this Chlamydia psittaci infects human cells and causes disease. So that's kind of the history of the disease.
Yeah, and we see the situation in Argentina, but there's been some sporadic large outbreaks over some recent years. Like we've seen one in Norway somewhat recently. So every now and then we do see, hundreds of cases reported at a time, right?
Yes. So in 1980, I think the early 1980s, 1981 was an interesting outbreak because, like you mentioned, in Norway, they recorded over 500 cases
Yeah.
of parrot fever. But what was interesting about that was that most of the cases were related to bird handling, but Some of the cases were not. So there were small groups of families or schools where people had no contact with birds, but they still had parrot fever. So that was our first inkling that maybe human to human transmission is possible with psittacosis.
Yeah. Um, where is psittacosis found geographically?
It can be found anywhere, anywhere around the world. Especially, I think people at the highest risk are people who are pet owners who have a lot of birds and
Mm,
maybe don't clean, keep their birds in sanitary conditions, but they're at risk. People who run pet shops or are dealers in birds, but, they large scale import and export of birds or handle them, veterinarians who handle them. So around the world you can get parrot fever,
yeah.
and as just
So let's go ahead and dive into the pathology because this can become a very serious disease, right? So what's the pathology of psittacosis and what kind of symptoms would somebody see?
So in humans, the symptoms are usually mild. So that's the good news, but they can become severe. So in their mild state, they actually look like the flu. So you can have fever, you can have headaches and muscle pains, and the chills. So dry cough. So many people may not even know that they have psittacosis until it progresses to a more severe state where you can have pneumonia, which is what's happening in Argentina right now. So there are a lot more cases of pneumonia going on, um, which is then analyzed and studied, and then they figure out that it's parrot fever. The pathology of the disease. So the parrot fever, the bacteria is very clever. So it's good at evading diagnosis. What it does is it actually works in two stages. So in the first stage, it's called an EP or an elementary body. It's a little inactive little body that can survive in under any condition. So it can survive outside a host, and once it's in the host, that's when it starts working. Once it gets into a host, it differentiate or evolves into something called an RB, which is a reticulate body.
Mhm.
And these bodies are active, so they can cause infection, but they kind of hold off and they're kind of almost charging the batteries up before they can get a full scale infection going. So they suck the energy out of the host's ATP cells and build up their own reservoir, and then they start infecting. They get to a certain amount, a certain quantity, after which the body's immune system kicks in, and that's when you start seeing the symptoms. So it's usually an immune response. They primarily go for the lungs and the respiratory tract, which is
Mhm.
why you have similar symptoms to like the flu. And some of these RB cells cluster together and form EB cells, EB bodies. So then they kind of start the cycle all over again. So that's the pathology of the disease.
Mm.
Because they do not grow outside, or they do not grow outside the host, it's actually very hard to grow them in labs. And that's another reason why diagnosis is very hard when it comes to parrot fever.
Right. So that's really runs into my next question. How do you diagnose it? What is it now? PCR? What's out there?
Yeah. What usually happens is, because most of the symptoms are mild, so and antibiotics are widely available. So if you give doxycycline to a patient and they feel better, so they're easy, or you get a chest X-ray, they can diagnose the pneumonia and then treat it accordingly. So a lot of parrot fever cases may not even be reported. I mean, it is reportable in the United States, but a lot of them may not be diagnosed or reported if the symptoms just go away. I think it becomes a bigger issue when there are a bunch of cases where you think there's an outbreak going on, which then you need special lab tests that can. So you need to grow the bacteria in cultures, but with specific medium that can help you grow the bacteria even outside the host cell. So that yeah, so it is hard to diagnose.
Yeah, yeah. So it acts very much like any other type of chlamydia. It's an intracellular parasite of sorts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. And you talked about treatment with doxycycline. So it's treated with any kind of a tetracycline or
Yes. So I guess initially when when they only had penicillin. Penicillin was the drug of choice.
Mhm.
But a few years later, after penicillin was widely available, tetracyclines came into the market, so they became the main standard of care. And doxycycline showed up, I think, in the 1970s. So that from then, that's the best, most effective treatment for parrot fever, unless like you have small children or certain people who are allergic to it or just doesn't work on them. In that case, you can give them azithromycin. But if
Okay.
someone watching this thinks they have parrot fever or signs of it, or they've infected birds, or they've traveled somewhere where they've handled birds and they feel sick, I would recommend they go get checked with a healthcare provider.
Of course. And as far as prevention is just avoiding birds.
I don't know. I guess I don't want to tell bird owners what to do. I don't want them coming after me. But I would recommend not kissing them on the beak,
Yeah.
or having basically a little more safety around how you handle them. Cleaning the bird cages, making sure they're clean, keeping an eye out for signs of infection. They may have swollen eyes, they may have nasal droplets coming out, they
Mhm.
may have green or yellow droppings, the diarrhea. They may lose interest. Basically, they can show signs of depression
Mhm.
almost. They're tired. They don't move around as much. They keep fluffing up their feathers or ruffling up their feathers. So there are some signs that you can keep an eye
Yeah.
out for, and get
Okay.
them checked in time.
Excellent. Any final thoughts on psittacosis?
Yes, psittacosis is, there's no vaccine, there's no huge outbreaks that are happening, but it is a category B bioterrorism agent, as categorized by the US CDC. And that is because it can be aerosolized and spread to a widespread uh, group of people and make them sick. Two, it's not easily diagnosed specifically to identify the particular bacteria. So the CDC will need to then utilize special labs or special resources in order to for surveillance as well as diagnosis. So that's kind of why it's a second level threat. It can be aerosolized easily and spread. It can cause moderate disease and does have a mortality rate. So which is why it's a category B. So we should keep an eye on it. We must handle our birds carefully. It is a zoonotic disease, so which is, at any point we have to keep tracking it. We don't know if it will cause more widespread disease.
Okay,
So
very good.
prevention is important. Sorry.
So I would encourage anybody. I will put a link up to the Gideon Informatics blog site where Chandy provides a lot of articles. Very good. She does a lot of great research on this stuff, and so you can check it out for yourself. That'll be in the show notes. And I want to thank you, Chandy, for joining me again today to talk about psittacosis. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Robert. I had fun. Thank you.